The mastermind behind the Sunset Mesa body brokering scandal that rocked the quiet Colorado town of Montrose has been sentenced. Megan Hess will be serving 20 years in prison. Hess's mother and co-conspirator, Shirley Koch, received a lighter sentence of 15 years in prison. Both women were remanded at the end of the court session and were ordered to pay restitution, though the amount will be determined on March 6, 2023, due to the large amount of money and victims. Megan Hess, age 46, was sentenced to the maximum sentence of 20 years in prison after earlier pleading guilty to one count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting. According to the plea agreement, from 2010 through 2018, the defendant and others stole the bodies or body parts of more than 800 victims and then sold those remains to victims purchasing the remains for body broker services. Under the auspices of Sunset Mesa funeral directors, the defendant would frequently meet with victims seeking cremation services for themselves or their loved ones who had died. During those meetings, the defendant and others would represent to the victims that Sunset Mesa funeral directors would cremate decedents and provide their cremated remains back to the families. Instead, the defendant and others would harvest body parts from or prepare the entire bodies of the decedents for sale and body broker services. Shirley Koch, age 69, was sentenced to 15 years in prison after earlier pleading guilty to one count of mail fraud and aiding and abetting. According to the plea agreement, from 2010 through 2018, Koch was involved in meeting with families seeking cremation services for their loved ones who had died. In many instances, Koch and Hess neither discussed nor obtained authorization for donation of decedents' bodies or body parts for body broker services. In other instances, the topic of donation was raised by Hess or Koch and specifically rejected by the families. In such circumstances, despite lacking any authorization, Koch and Hess recovered body parts from or otherwise prepared entire bodies of hundreds of decedents for body broker services. In the few instances where families agreed to donation, Hess and Koch sold the remains of those decedents beyond what was authorized by the family, which was often limited to small tissue samples, tumors, or portions of skin. Hess and Koch also delivered cremains to families with the representation that the cremains were that of the deceased when frequently that was not the case. According to the plea agreements, Hess and Koch will also ship bodies and body parts that tested positive for or belonging to people who had died from infectious diseases, including hepatitis B and C and HIV, after certifying to buyers that the remains were disease-free. These shipments would be through the mail or on commercial air flights in violation of Department of Transportation regulations regarding the transportation of hazardous materials. Judge Christine Argulo sentenced Hess and Koch on January 3rd, 2023.
When everything first came out, we were like, no way, she was too nice. We couldn't, it was hard for us to believe. And then my father got the phone call from the FBI that we found out my mother was sold as a full body.
The FBI raided Sunset Mesa Funeral Home in 2018. Victims like Chrissy Hartman, who lost her mother, say what they found was devastating.
We felt like she died all over again, only it was worse. It was 2018 when we were informed. She died in 2013. We were just finally getting to a place in our lives where we could talk about her and share the stories with laughter instead of tears.
Judy Kressler told me she had suspicions way back in 2016 and even reported it to the Department of Regulatory Agencies in Colorado, but nothing came of it.
They did absolutely nothing with my complaint and my suspicions for 2 years until the FBI raid in February of 18.
Now in 2022, 4 years have passed since the FBI raid. The raid uncovered a litany of horrific practices and greed. Both Hess and Koch have pleaded guilty, but for victims, this painful experience isn't over yet. The women still have sentencing hearings ahead, and the families say they'll be there.
they're not remorseful for their crimes. They made that very clear. In fact, last week, Megan Hess called this a legal travesty.
Many victims have no idea where their family members are now. And one victim told me when her father died more recently, she was so traumatized by the experience, she had to check to make sure her father was actually in the casket before they buried him.
This case is unlike any seen in the U.S. before, with the only case remotely similar occurring in Washington state. This case falls outside the heartland of any other case in the United States, said the judge. Hess argues altruistic motives. Hess did not address the court during the sentencing hearing. In a statement, defense attorney Ashley Petrie said Hess's motivation was to advance medical research. She also said the rates that Hess charged were well below market rates for similar services and suggested they were aimed more at helping families gain an affordable funeral than enriching Hess. Apology from Koch. Koch, meanwhile, told the court she acknowledged her guilt and take responsibilities for her actions and said she was very sorry for the harm caused to families. These two women preyed on vulnerable victims who turned to them in a time of grief and sadness, but instead of offering guidance, these greedy women betrayed the trust of hundreds of victims and mutilated their loved ones, said FBI Denver Acting Special Agent in Charge Leonard Carollo. Without knowledge or consent, the woman disrespected the wishes of the grieving victims and degraded the bodies of their family members to sell them for profit. These two criminals continued in their atrocities for years, showing no remorse or contrition even after they were exposed. Nothing can guarantee solace for the victims or repair the damage done, but perhaps this sentence can mark the end of a horrible chapter in their lives. This case was complex and involved a detailed forensic review of evidence. The investigation was led by the FBI Denver Division and the Department of Transportation Office of the Inspector General.